Thanks so much for everyone being here and having me. I think what brings me to this conversation, and maybe what brings many of you here today, is really a fear for some of our most sacred values. A diverse society, openness to technology, dynamism, openness to change. These are the sorts of things that I think many of us feel are increasingly under threat today. And it's not just here in the United States. It's in Britain. It's in Italy. It's in Spain. It's really all over the world. Brazil, where I'm going next week. And at the same time, if we ask ourselves, what are these under threat from? It's easy to point to the Bolsonaros and Trumps and so forth of the world. But the truth, I think, is that in a larger sense, they're under threat from their own failures. Liberalism promised us that the internet would give us this huge explosion of democracy, of opportunities for people. And yet we've seen perhaps an unprecedented in history concentration of power into the hands of a few technological platforms that have perhaps more control than anyone has ever had over the way billions of people around the world perceive and understand the world. We were promised that democracy, free Aung San Suu Kyi, everything will go great in Myanmar. And it didn't work out so great for these folks up there. We were promised that if we privatize things like the radio spectrum, that we are going to end up with an explosion of innovation and opportunity. And instead, we've ended up with a huge fraction of it fragmented among a bunch of over-the-air broadcasters, and the rest controlled by a few large telecommunications companies that are not delivering services anywhere near the standard of our rivals in China, Israel, etc. And we were told that if we embrace globalization, it would be a ship that rising water would lift everyone's boats. And in fact, instead, we've seen working class people being left behind all over the world. Now, what went wrong? Why did we end up here? Well, my view is that there were some fundamental assumptions underlying the way we've set up the world that were just wrong and pretty clearly wrong. We have this imaginary of the entrepreneurial individual making their own way on their own. And yet, almost all the value we get comes from networks. And when you make a network the private property of an individual, why should you be surprised that we're going to end up in the situation we do? We said democracy is going to be great, will of the majority. And yet we live in increasingly diverse societies where the will of the majority is not always what we want to serve. We pretended like just, giving freedom to labor, meritocracy was going to sort everything out. And we forget that capital is incredibly concentrated and workers are incredibly dispersed. So some of the basic assumptions we knew were wrong in the way that we set up societies. However, that doesn't mean that the only alternative is central planning. It doesn't mean that the only alternative is ethno-nationalism. There's actually a long philosophical tradition. People like Marquis de Condorcet, Alexis de Tocqueville, Henry George, Beatrice Webb, Hannah Arendt, William Vickery. These are thinkers, philosophers, who have tried to imagine ways that we could have a society that is liberal, open, diverse, embraces technology and dynamism, and yet isn't based on naive individualism or naive assumptions about capital and the way that it works. So the book that I wrote with Eric Posner, Radical Markets, starts to make a start on using the new tools that we have from technology, the new tools we have from economics, and these philosophical ideas to imagine a radically different way that we can actually, by embracing markets and technology, address some of these fundamental flaws in the way that we've architected our society. Now, there's a bunch of policy prescriptions in this book, and I don't have anywhere near the time to get into discussing them, but I just want to give you a flavor of a few of the things that we're working on to help spur your imagination to think beyond the usual categories we have and imagine a world that is simultaneously far more equal, but also far more open, dynamic, and diverse, and flexible to market, to the exploration of possibilities that markets allow. So I think this really starts at its base with how we think about ourselves as individuals. What is the individual? Usually, we are told two competing narratives, both of which I think are fundamentally wrong. One group is individualistic. It says, we are totally in control of ourselves, we're independent, we make our own way, we shouldn't be tied down to any commitments. The other side tells us that we belong to a nation state or some other particular group, maybe a race, depending on who you're talking to, and that is the essence of who we are. And I think both of these ideas are fundamentally broken. Because all of us deeply belong to and are defined by a huge range of different communities that we participate in. Our religion, our local community, our national community, our profession, all these things determine what we want, what we identify with, and really who we are. And I think the most interesting people you know, if you reflect upon them, the most individual, the ones you think are most individuals, you'll realize what makes them an individual is precisely that they are a unique intersection of different communities. And if you have that view of an individual, it's not just a philosophy, it's not just a way of imagining the world, it can actually be a foundation for fundamentally different ways of setting up our technologies. Our technologies right now are based on when you show your identity, you show an identity card issued by the US government, you show your Facebook credentials. But in reality, what actually defines you is not any of that. What really defines you is the whole web of social connections that you have and all the ways in which the information about you is shared with other people. Your mother's date of birth is also your mother's date of birth, and your grandmother's date of the birth of her first daughter, right? And we can actually build technologies, and again, I won't go into any of the technical details, that are actually based on that principle, that actually ground in our social relationships the way our formal identities are verified online and the way our data is held. So it's not in some silo for us individually, nor is it held by some giant platform. Now, if we're defined by these communities, then our social policy has to be about as well allowing this flowering of diverse, emergent communities that empower us. But the problem is our economic and political systems stand in the way of it. Capitalism is based on this notion of isolated individuals, and it undermines the provision of public goods that we all need in order to have communities. And at the same time, majority rule nation states don't do what we want either. They're fixed, they're rigid, and they put such important policy issues in the control of people who really have very little to say about them much of the time. You think about the drug war. The drug war is really a war waged allegedly for the benefit of and largely against black and brown people in the United States and Central America. And yet who decides the drug war? The majority of people in the United States. What does that have to do with anything? And that shouldn't be a surprise, because majority rule will serve the majority. So the question is, what is the alternative? And together with Vitalik Buterin, who is the founder of Ethereum, the largest blockchain platform, and a philosopher, poet, economist at Harvard, we proposed a new system for setting up organizations that's an alternative to both corporations and to nation states. And it's based on the principle of matching funds that any of you who actually live in New York City are probably familiar with. In New York, if you give money to a politician up to $100, you get a 6-for-1 match as long as there's 999 other people contributing, which creates this sort of fusion of the public and the private. It responds to people's interest, but it also is not based on just pure capitalism where I have an incentive to just free ride on everybody else. But the question is, why $600? Why $100? Why 6 for 1 match? Why 9? Those are all arbitrary. Is there a way to use matching funds like this to actually create sort of an optimal provision of public goods that emerges and creates a powerful civil society? And I'm not expecting any of you to understand this math up there, but it turns out that there is a mathematical formula that does that. And it's increasingly being used, as I'll talk about in a moment, to create these diverse, open ecosystems of public good provision. Finally, how are we going to pay for all this? Where do all those matching funds come from? Well, it turns out that private property itself, by its very nature, tends to create monopolies that actually impede the flow of the free market. Private property tends to create these huge agglomerations of power in places like the large platforms, or impediments to public projects, as illustrated here. So what we propose is a new system of property under which all the assets that are owned by large corporations and so forth, the spectrum and so forth, rather than being private property where they can just hold on to it, instead are allocated competitively, actually more competitively than they are under existing market systems, through a sort of auction-like process, but where the proceeds of that auction don't return to some corporation, but rather to a common pool that can fund the creation of these communities, and therefore will be distributed in an egalitarian way. Now, this is just a taste of the sorts of wild ideas that we are throwing out there. But as wild as they sound, they're actually having a huge impact on the world that I couldn't possibly have imagined. This book just came out about 9 months ago. But in that time, about 120 startups have formed implementing ideas around the book. There's about 120 chapters all around the world, everywhere from Latin America, where I'm about to go for a week and a half, to talk about these ideas to some of those groups, to Asia, all throughout the United States, in urban and even rural areas. We just had a conference of 500 people in Detroit talking about these types of ideas. Here are some of our chapters in Singapore and Latin America. There are artists. So actually, the person who took over leadership of this organization from me is an artist named Jennifer Marone. And they've produced games, new rules for Monopoly, virtual reality simulations, science fiction stories, helping people imagine what this world is like. But it's also been of tremendous interest to academics. That's where I came out of. I was an academic. But computer scientists, historians, sociologists are all working to build realistic, serious, rigorous, grounded in the best economic and computational theory alternatives to the broken system that we live in. And Governor Gavin Newsom in California actually proposed a law recently based on some of these ideas that's working its way through the legislative process there. Margaret de Vestager, the Commissioner of Antitrust for the European Union, is embracing some of these ideas as she announced in January. Here's one of the startups that's been building these open source ecosystems based on some of these ideas. So as wild as these things sound, I actually think that in our present world, the truth is that moderation, little steps, may actually be the most impractical thing of all because of the dissatisfaction that's out there. Whereas if we can have a bold vision of a better and different way to live, the truth is we can unite people from across the political spectrum who are dissatisfied with the status quo and offer a real opportunity that embraces the values that we share. Thank you.